Student loans now average the cost of a brand new Lexus per graduate. Realistic plan to pay it back? I don't know, suck dick on OnlyFans in the back of a Lexus? Student loans are crazy. They didn't exist in the past, like AIDS. And just like AIDS, this shit really only showed up in the 80s. Total student debt in the 80s was $10 billion, considered crazy then. Total student debt now is $1.7 trillion. They thought this shit was out of control even back then. From the New York Times, 1987. Heavy burden of college debt raises anxiety for young families' future. In 1986, more than 25% of students had debt over $21,000 today's dollars. The average debt now is 40 grand. What is that other than financial HIV given to America's kids? AIDS got a cure. There ain't no Truvada for debt. What changed? You know, tuition was almost 10 grand in the 80s. They only actually paid 3 grand because state governments paid 75% of tuition for every boomer who went to college, even ones who complain about socialism. I'm going to say that again. Boomers didn't have to take student loans because state governments paid 75% of their tuition. And they tell you not to buy coffee and make sandwiches at home like this generation of Americans are the sons and daughters of Soviet peasants. They started cutting state funding starting in the 80s. Tuition rose and the only way to pay was loans. Debt exploded. In 93, student loan debt was just $9,000. 30 years later, it's 40 grand, the cost of a new Tesla or Lexus. That's insane. At the same rate, average student debt in 30 years will be 160 grand. That's a lot of avocado toast. 3 out of 4 jobs require college now. Forget personal choices. That is why millennials are facing historic levels of debt and Gen Z is right behind them. It's also why boomers are #1 in the world for college degrees in their age category and millennials are 12th. That is a real-world example of what happens when you change your tax code to serve billionaires instead of the working and middle class, which also started in the 80s. Boomers grew up in a country that invested in education, then stripped those very same programs that invested in education. Overall state funding is about half of what it was when they went to school. They're like the shitty parents from Home Alone. Boomers are sitting in first class while they left their kids behind. Except they're not just fucking one kid, they're fucking generations. This is not starting families or buying houses. This is what student loans make an American generation into indentured servants to banks. But unlike student loans, indentured servants were able to pay their debt after 7 years. It takes an average of 18.5 years to pay off student loans. You got 20 to life, son. Who needs college anyways? It should only be for the rich, not peasants. Except for peasants, like actual real 14th century English peasants, got anywhere from 8 weeks to half the year off. Meanwhile, the American worker gets an average of 8 days. Peasants even got times off for weddings and if sports events were in town, imagine telling your boss, "Oh, fuck off, Jeff, the Knicks are in town." If an actual kaiju invasion happened, you'd still have to show up for work because loan payments, and the boss doesn't allow work from home during kaiju invasions anymore because it really hurts team chemistry. The only reason peasants got this much time off is the ruling class was so afraid of them they made it mandatory. Keep that in mind the next time somebody tells you Congress gets 239 days off a year. And that's why we make sure you're not educated, because an educated populace is a dangerous one. So keep believing dumb shit conspiracy theories like the Illuminati Sasquatch Guild that keeps you from learning basic facts about your society that then holds you back from improving a government that is made up by human beings that will one day be you. It's almost like believing in dumb conspiracies keeps you from improving the real world around you and serves to only reinforce current societal inequities like the fucking fact that the average person under 40 spends more on student loans a month than most families do on groceries. Over half of Americans now go into debt to pay for college, with it taking 20 years to pay off student loans. How is that anything other than the robbery of a generation? That is the story of America in the last 30 years, and that should be on the news every night. In the 80s, before cable news and social media changed America's ability to share a common reality, these are the types of stories that were led the evening broadcast. It's almost like a shared common reality is necessary to a healthy democracy and economy, and this generation will never know what it's like. But luckily for you, through the transdimensional powers of hell, we can actually show you. Here's 80s News Today. Hi everybody, 80s News Today, coming to you live from San Francisco, where I've been having tons of unprotected sex. In the news today, an aide of Ronald Reagan warned of a new pandemic spread through sexual contact. Probably not real. Let's hear what this government official has to say, who we'll probably never hear from again.
Dr. Fauci, do you see a pattern in the spread of AIDS worldwide?
Well, the pattern is that it's clearly being established as a worldwide epidemic. Sounds like bullshit. Listen, I get my sex advice from a real estate magnate. Reagan officials also announced a new plan today called trickle-down economics, where we'll take money from the working and middle class and give it to the rich, and a reverse socialism scheme they'll later repackage on something called cable news. That's freedom. Cable news. Like, that'll never be a thing. Buy stocks in the evening news and newspaper. They'll never go away, just like Pan Am and the Francis Scott Key Bridge, or the middle class, or the country's ability to provide a better life for its next generation. In other news, in Afghanistan, American ally Osama bin Laden continues to be a trusted friend of the United States. Bill Cosby remains a beloved TV father with absolutely zero controversy surrounding him, other than those sweaters, am I right, Diane? And retired football star O.J. Simpson continues to be a fantastic spokesman and actor, and nothing more. That's a good man. That's it. God, life is so easy. I've been Shaan Joshi, and this is news.
State cuts in the 80s started a 40-year decline and support problems made worse by a once-in-a-generation recession and pandemic that only further expanded and enforced those cuts. The result has been that state funding for higher education currently sits around 48 to 50% below where it did in 1981. While administrative bloat is part of increase in college costs, it is minuscule compared to the loss of public education funding. Let's just isolate one decade and see how policy can affect real life. From 2000 to 2010, public education funding fell 21%. Those very same cuts were responsible for 80% of the tuition increases at the same time. That 80% rise led to a 33% increase in tuition in just one decade. That's not inflation, baby. That's baked in. It ain't ever coming down. Again, 75% of boomers' college tuition was paid for by the government. A $10K tuition became $2,500. A 20-year student loan debt turned into summer jobs if you grinded at Domino's, which is very different than grinding on OnlyFans for a dude named Domino. Post-boomer generations have faced constant exploitation from the parental class. They face a once-in-a-generation recession, a once-in-a-generation pandemic, all of it, and that still doesn't include Madam Web. Some stood up. Some tried to warn you. Hunter Thompson saw it coming after a once-in-a-generation terrorist attack. Poor bastards of what will forever be known as Generation Z are doomed to be the first generation of Americans who will grow up with a lower standard of living than their parents enjoyed. That is extremely heavy news, and it will take a while for it to sink in. The 22 babies born in New York City while the World Trade Center burned will never know what they missed. The last half of the 20th century will seem like a wild party for rich kids compared to what's coming now. The party's over, folks. That was when Bush declared war on Iraq. Dude called the 21st century like Kobe calls game winners, and it's not getting any better. The middle class is dying, which means this generation has less chance of moving up. If the American dream isn't dead, it's certainly been to one too many parties with Diddy. Things change in 30 years. Remember the Diddy song all about the Benjamins? Now it's where's Benjamin and is he safe? And it's not just Benjamin. Boomers in Congress Diddy the financial future of the country. In 1995, the middle class had twice as much wealth as the top 1%. Today, the top 1% has more wealth than the entire middle 60% of the country. That's insane. That's not even the same country anymore. It's why the American dream feels so unattainable now, because it's not the same country. The middle class isn't even the majority anymore in size or economic share. The rich only controlled 23% of the economy in 1970, less than half the middle class. It's now at 50% control, half the economy. The middle class, meantime, once at a 60% majority, has fallen to the low 40s. Regular Americans have been the victims of massive wealth redistribution, and many don't know it. That redistribution has created a permanent economic superclass that is shrinking the middle class while expanding more and more people into poverty. America is a socialist country. It's just socialism for the rich. The top 1% haven't had this much wealth since the Depression. No, not the week you spent bed rotting, the actual Great Depression. Yeah, that's a bad thing. In fact, starting in 2018, the top 1% paid lower tax rates than the working class for the first time in history. I mean, why should billionaires pay tax for America's military and foreign services and the stability it allows them for their massive business platforms to operate? I mean, who benefits more from diplomats than Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos? I mean, why should the Walmarts and the Amazons, whose massive fleets of trucks degrade American infrastructure more than anybody else, have to pay taxes? No, it's much more reasonable that America ceases to become a middle-class country and have the same wealth distribution as Russia, no coincidence, and have about the same chance of upward mobility. No, seriously, America's income inequality is now on par with Russia. Most people in Russia don't have toilets. The income inequality trajectory observed in the United States is largely due to massive educational inequalities combined with a tax system that grew less progressive despite a surge in top labor compensation since the 80s and in top capital incomes in the 2000s. There's no conspiracy. The people robbing you are writing it clear as day in boring policy changes in student loans, campaign finance, and yes, taxes on fucking C-SPAN. They count on your your apathy, on your intellectual disinterest. They expect to be more interested in the politics of propaganda than the politics of legislation, because politics without legislation is propaganda. Whatever cause you care about doesn't exist until it exists in legislation you can pass. Tax code isn't sexy. It's not going to get you laid, but it will one day get you a house. Don't have pop culture wars, have legislation wars. Don't care what comics say, care what politicians say, because we're good at propaganda. We'll keep selling tax cuts and lack of student loan relief or a plan as freedom in America while we rob America blind and actually kill the middle class and blame it on immigrants and socialism. Even with that, fixing America isn't as far off as you think. Even with just single-digit tax increases on billionaires and corporations, campaign finance, and student loan reform, you're getting your back on track. In the meantime, the American dream is welcome in hell. After all, Diddy throws the best parties here. This has been doomed tonight because you're fucked.